The morning sun bathed the sprawling suburban neighborhood in soft light, the kind that made everything feel calm and new. Among the many homes stood Shaquille O'Neal's mansion, a massive but welcoming estate with manicured lawns and towering gates. Despite its grandeur, Shaq had always made it a point to stay humble, treating everyone he met with respect and kindness. That day, like many others, a small silver car pulled up to the gate. From it stepped Maria, a middle-aged housekeeper with a warm smile and tired eyes. She carried her cleaning supplies in one hand and adjusted her worn jacket with the other. Maria had worked for Shaq for over a year, cleaning his home twice a week. To her, it was just a job, one she was grateful for, but didn't expect to lead to anything extraordinary. Maria entered the house using the key Shaq had provided her. The air inside was cool and still, the faint scent of polished wood lingering in the expansive living room. She set down her supplies and got to work, as she always did, moving efficiently from room to room. The mansion's size never ceased to amaze her. High ceilings, marble floors, and walls adorned with photos of Shaq's career milestones gave the space a museum-like quality. But Maria didn't let herself get distracted. She had a job to do, and she took pride in doing it well. As she vacuumed the grand staircase, she paused to catch her breath. Life had been hard lately. Her husband's medical bills had piled up, and her 2 children were working part-time jobs to help make ends meet. Despite the challenges, Maria kept going, her quiet determination driving her forward. Meanwhile, Shaq had been watching. Unbeknownst to Maria, he had arrived home earlier than usual that day. Standing quietly in the doorway to the kitchen, he observed her as she wiped down the counters, her movements careful and deliberate. Over the past year, he had grown to admire Maria's work ethic and positive attitude, even when she didn't know he was around. But today, something was different. Shaq had noticed how tired she looked, how her shoulders slumped slightly when she thought no one was watching. It was a small detail, but it struck him deeply. He knew her life wasn't easy, and while she never complained, he could see the weight she carried. Shaq's mind began to race. He had always believed in giving back, in using his blessings to help others. Watching Maria now, he felt a strong urge to do something meaningful, something that would change her life. Maria continued her work, unaware of Shaq's presence. As she finished dusting the shelves in the living room, she glanced at a family photo on the mantel. It was a candid shot of Shaq surrounded by his children, their smiles genuine and joyful. Maria couldn't help but smile too. She thought about her own family and how much she wanted to give them a better life. Lost in thought, she didn't notice Shaq step into the room. "Maria," his deep voice rumbled softly. Startled, she turned quickly, her cleaning rag still in hand. "Oh, Mr. O'Neal, I didn't know you were home." Shaq smiled warmly, his towering frame making the room feel smaller. "I got back a little early," he said casually. "How's everything going?" Maria nodded, her smile polite. "It's good, sir. Just finishing up." Shaq's expression softened as he looked at her. "You've been working hard, Maria. I see it every time you're here." Maria blushed slightly, ducking her head. "Thank you, sir. I just try to do my best." Shaq nodded, his mind already formulating a plan. "Well, finish up when you're ready. I'll be around." Maria watched him leave the room, her heart still racing from the unexpected encounter. She quickly returned to her work, eager to finish her tasks. Later that afternoon, Maria gathered her supplies and prepared to leave. As she reached the front door, she found Shaq waiting for her. In his hands was a sealed envelope. "This is for you," he said, handing it to her. Maria looked at him, puzzled. "What is it?" "Just open it when you get home," Shaq said with a wink. Maria hesitated, her curiosity piqued, but she nodded. "Thank you, Mr. O'Neal." When Maria arrived home that evening, her children greeted her at the door. Her husband, sitting in his favorite chair, looked up with a tired but warm smile. Maria set her cleaning supplies down and opened the envelope Shaq had given her. Inside was a handwritten note and a check. The note read, "Maria, I've watched how hard you work, not just for me, but for your family. You've shown me what real strength and dedication look like. I wanted to do something to thank you for all that you do. This check is for you and your family. Use it however you need, whether it's for bills, your kids' education, or just to take a break. You deserve it. With gratitude, Shaq." Maria's hands trembled as she unfolded the check. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw the amount. $50,000. Tears filled her eyes as she stared at the check, her mind racing. $50,000, she whispered, barely able to believe what she was seeing. Her children crowded around her, their eyes wide with amazement. Her husband, too stunned to speak at first, finally said, "Maria, this is life-changing." Maria nodded, her tears flowing freely now. "I don't know why he did this," she said, her voice breaking. "But I'll never forget it." The next day, Maria returned to Shaq's house. This time she wasn't there to clean. She knocked on the door, the check and note clutched tightly in her hands. When Shaq answered, she looked up at him, her eyes still red from crying. "Mr. O'Neill," she began, her voice shaking. "I don't even know how to thank you." Shaq smiled, his expression kind. "You don't have to thank me, Maria. You've earned it." Maria shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks again. "This is too much." Shaq chuckled softly. "It's not enough, if you ask me. You've been taking care of everyone else for so long. I wanted to take care of you." Maria wiped her tears, her gratitude overwhelming. "You've changed our lives," she said simply. Shaq nodded, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You've changed mine too, Maria. Don't ever forget that." Word of Shaq's generosity spread quickly after Maria shared her story with a local news outlet. The story went viral, with people around the world praising Shaq for his kindness and highlighting Maria's hard work and dedication. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the reminder that small acts of kindness, when paired with generosity, could transform lives. For Maria, the gift wasn't just financial. It was a chance to breathe, to dream, and to finally give her family the stability they deserved. And for Shaq, it was another opportunity to live out his belief that success means nothing if you can't use it to lift others up. Years later, Maria would still speak of that day, the day her hard work was recognized and her life was forever changed. And every time she told the story, she would end with the same words. "Shaq didn't just give me money, he gave me hope." The upscale restaurant was buzzing with life, its polished wooden floors reflecting the warm glow of the chandeliers above. Waiters moved swiftly between tables, balancing trays of gourmet dishes, while soft jazz music played in the background. The clientele was a mix of affluent families, couples on dates, and business people closing deals. At a corner table near the back, Shaquille O'Neal sat with two friends, enjoying a casual evening out. Despite his towering frame and celebrity status, Shaq preferred to keep things low-key. He wore a simple button-down shirt, his laughter blending into the hum of the busy room as he shared stories with his companions. Nearby, another table caught Shaq's attention. A young couple sat in an awkward silence, the tension between them palpable. The man, sharply dressed in a tailored suit, exuded arrogance. His date, a woman in her late 20s with a soft smile and kind eyes, appeared uncomfortable, her body language closed off as she glanced nervously around the room. Shaq's eyes narrowed slightly as he noticed the man speaking to her in a sharp, dismissive tone. Though the words were muffled by the ambient noise, the man's body language was clear, leaning back with an air of superiority, gesturing dismissively, and barely acknowledging the woman as she tried to speak. A waiter approached the couple's table, setting down their drinks. The man waved him off impatiently, muttering something under his breath. The woman murmured a quiet "thank you" to the waiter, her voice barely audible. Shaq observed the interaction, his easygoing demeanor fading into quiet focus. As the evening wore on, the man's behavior became more pronounced. He berated the woman for taking too long to decide on her order, rolled his eyes when she spoke, and at one point leaned across the table, pointing a finger at her as his voice rose above the din. Heads turned, and the woman's cheeks flushed with embarrassment as she looked down at her hands. Shaq exchanged a glance with his friends, his expression darkening. "You see that?" he muttered, his voice low but firm. They nodded, their own faces mirroring his disapproval. Shaq leaned back in his chair, his towering frame making even the oversized furniture look small. He wasn't the type to involve himself in drama, but this was different. The disrespect unfolding in front of him struck a nerve. He had always believed in treating others with kindness and dignity, and watching this man belittle his date was something he couldn't ignore. The pivotal moment came when the man snapped his fingers at the waiter, his voice dripping with entitlement. "Can we get some service here?" he barked. Then, turning to the woman, he added loudly, "This place is a waste of money, just like tonight." The woman's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she reached for her purse, mumbling something about leaving. Before she could stand, however, Shaq was already on his feet. The room seemed to quiet as the 7'1" basketball legend crossed the restaurant in a few deliberate strides. His presence was impossible to ignore, and heads turned as diners whispered among themselves, wondering what was about to happen. Shaq stopped at the couple's table, towering over the man, whose confident demeanor faltered the moment he realized who was standing before him. "Excuse me," Shaq said, his deep voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Is there a problem here?" The man blinked, momentarily speechless. No problem," he stammered, glancing nervously at the other diners who were now openly watching the scene. Shaq's gaze shifted to the woman. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked gently. She hesitated, her voice trembling as she replied, "I'm fine. Thank you." Shaq nodded, then turned back to the man. "You sure about that? Because it doesn't look like it." The man's face turned red as he struggled to maintain his composure. "Look, I don't know who you think you are. I'm the guy who doesn't like seeing people treated like trash," Shaq interrupted, his voice dropping to a steely calm. "Especially in public." The restaurant fell silent, the weight of Shaq's words hanging in the air. The man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confidence completely eroded. Shaq leaned in slightly, his towering frame making the man shrink back. "Here's the deal," he said, his tone even but firm. "You're gonna apologize to her, right now." The man hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Fine," he muttered, barely glancing at his date. "I'm sorry." "Not like that," Shaq said, his voice sharp enough to make the man flinch. "Say it like you mean it." The man looked at the woman, his expression a mix of embarrassment and resentment. "I'm sorry," he said again, louder this time. The woman nodded, her voice quiet. "Thank you." Shaq straightened up, his gaze never leaving the man. "Good. Now, if you're done ruining her night, why don't you let her enjoy the rest of it in peace?" The man stared at Shaq, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to form a response. Finally, he grabbed his wallet, threw a few bills on the table, and stormed out of the restaurant, his departure marked by the murmurs of other diners. Shaq turned back to the woman, his expression softening. "You okay?" he asked again. She nodded, managing a small smile. "I am now. Thank you." Shaq smiled and motioned to the waiter. "Whatever she wants, put it on my tab," he said. Then, looking back at the woman, he added, "You deserve to be treated better than that." The woman's eyes filled with gratitude as she thanked him. Shaq gave her a reassuring nod before returning to his own table. As he sat down, his friends gave him approving looks, and the room slowly returned to its usual buzz, though the energy had shifted. The story of what had just happened spread quickly among the diners, with many whispering about Shaq's quiet but powerful intervention. By the next day, the story had gone viral. A fellow diner had captured the entire exchange on video, and it quickly circulated online. Headlines praised Shaq for standing up against mistreatment, with fans and commentators alike applauding his actions. Social media was flooded with posts, many sharing similar stories of Shaq's generosity and kindness. The video of him calmly confronting the man while ensuring the woman was okay became a symbol of standing up for what's right, even in small moments. For Shaq, it wasn't about the attention or the accolades. It was about living by his principles, treating people with respect and stepping in when he saw something wrong. And for the woman, that night became a turning point, a reminder that she deserved kindness and dignity. Years later, she would still tell the story of the night Shaquille O'Neal stood up for her, turning an otherwise painful evening into a moment of hope and empowerment. Because sometimes the simplest acts, offering support, demanding respect, and standing up for others, are the ones that resonate the most. The scent of fries and burgers filled the small McDonald's restaurant, blending with the hum of machines and the occasional beeping from the fryers. It was a typical evening shift, with customers lining up, their voices blending into a steady murmur. Behind the counter stood Carlos, a 35-year-old single father, his uniform neatly pressed but showing signs of wear. He greeted customers with a polite smile, though exhaustion lingered in his eyes. Working back-to-back shifts wasn't uncommon for him. He did whatever it took to provide for his 8-year-old daughter, Sophia. Carlos glanced at the clock above the drive-through window. It was just past 7 p.m., and his shift wouldn't end for another 3 hours. His mind wandered briefly to Sophia, who was home with a neighbor. Her birthday was tomorrow, and Carlos had been saving every extra penny for weeks, hoping to buy her the doll she had been asking for. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a small token to show her how much he cared. But even that felt like a stretch on his paycheck. As Carlos served the next customer, the door swung open, and a man in a casual blazer and jeans walked in. His presence didn't draw much attention at first. He looked like any other customer, but as he stepped closer to the counter, a few heads turned, and whispers began to ripple through the room. It was Elon Musk. Carlos didn't notice at first, too focused on ringing up an order. When he finally looked up, his eyes widened slightly in recognition. "Good evening," he said, his voice steady despite the surprise. "What can I get for you?" Elon smiled warmly. "Just a cheeseburger and fries, please. To go." Carlos nodded, punching in the order. As he handed Elon the receipt, he noticed how friendly and unassuming the billionaire seemed. It wasn't every day you saw one of the richest men in the world ordering fast food. While waiting for his order, Elon leaned casually against the counter, observing the restaurant. His eyes landed on Carlos, who had returned to helping other customers. There was something about the man's demeanor, polite but weary, that caught Elon's attention. He noticed the slight sag in Carlos's shoulders, the way he counted change carefully, and the tired smile he offered each customer. Elon was no stranger to hard work. He had built his empire from the ground up. But he knew that the kind of grind Carlos was enduring was different, relentless, and often unappreciated. As Elon watched, he overheard snippets of a conversation between Carlos and a coworker. "You're still doing the double shift tomorrow?" the coworker asked. Carlos nodded, wiping his hands on a towel. "Yeah, gotta make sure Sophia has a good birthday." The coworker smiled sympathetically. "She's lucky to have you." Carlos shrugged, his expression softening. "She's my world." Elon's curiosity deepened. He hadn't expected to overhear something so personal, but the sincerity in Carlos's voice struck a chord. When his order was ready, Elon took the bag, but didn't leave immediately. Instead, he walked to an empty table near the back and sat down, his mind clearly working on something. Carlos, meanwhile, continued his shift, unaware that he was being observed. He kept moving, clearing trays, restocking supplies, and taking orders. It was routine, but tonight, it felt heavier. His thoughts kept drifting to Sophia and the small box wrapped in plain paper waiting in his locker. A second-hand doll he had managed to buy after weeks of saving. It wasn't much, but he hoped it would bring her joy. As the evening rush began to slow, Elon stood and approached the counter again. "Excuse me," he said, catching Carlos's attention. Carlos looked up, slightly surprised. "Yes, sir." "Is everything okay with your order?" Elon nodded. "Everything's fine. I just wanted to ask, what's your daughter's name?" Carlos blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Her name's Sophia," he said cautiously. Elon smiled. "She must be proud to have a dad like you." Carlos didn't know how to respond. I do my best." Elon nodded thoughtfully, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notepad. He scribbled something down, folded the paper, and handed it to Carlos. "This is for you," he said simply. Carlos hesitated, his brow furrowing. "What is it?" Elon smiled faintly. "Open it later." Before Carlos could ask more, Elon turned and left the restaurant, leaving Carlos standing there with the folded note in his hand. He slipped it into his pocket, his mind buzzing with questions. After his shift ended, Carlos walked home, the note still tucked in his pocket. Once inside, he set down his bag and checked on Sophia, who was fast asleep on the couch. Her favorite blanket was draped over her, and a faint smile played on her lips. Carlos sat down at the kitchen table, pulled out the note, and unfolded it. His hands trembled as he read the words. "Carlos, your dedication and love for your daughter are inspiring. I wanted to do something to help. Check your bank account tomorrow morning. Elon." Carlos's heart raced. What could this mean? He barely slept that night, his mind filled with possibilities. The next morning, Carlos woke early and logged into his bank account on his phone. His jaw dropped as he saw the balance, $50,000. He stared at the screen, blinking back tears. It didn't feel real. The money was enough to pay off his debts, cover Sophia's education, and give them both a chance at a better life. For the first time in years, Carlos felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Sophia wandered into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes. "Good morning, Daddy," she said sleepily. Carlos scooped her up, hugging her tightly. "Good morning, birthday girl." "What's wrong?" she asked, noticing the tears in his eyes. "Nothing, sweetheart," Carlos said, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything's perfect." Word of Elon's gesture spread quickly. Carlos shared his story with a local reporter, and soon, the story went viral. Social media buzzed with praise for Elon's generosity and for Carlos's dedication as a father. People from all over the world reached out, inspired by the simple but profound act of kindness. For Carlos, the money wasn't just about financial relief. It was a symbol of hope. A reminder that even in the hardest times, there were still people willing to help. And for Elon, it was another chance to live out his belief that success wasn't just about building empires. It was about lifting others up. Years later, Carlos would still tell Sophia the story of the night everything changed. And every time he did, he would end with the same words. "Kindness can change a life. It changed ours." It was a sunny afternoon in downtown Atlanta, the streets alive with the hum of city life. Food trucks lined the sidewalks, office workers rushed to grab their lunches, and families strolled leisurely through the squares. Among them was Shaquille O'Neal, a towering figure known not just for his basketball accolades, but for his infectious charisma and generosity. Having just wrapped up a business meeting, Shaq, dressed casually in a loose t-shirt and jeans, exuded a down-to-earth presence that belied his global fame. As he walked toward his car, the usual symphony of urban life was interrupted by a commotion near a small convenience store. Two police officers were detaining a black delivery driver named Darnell, who was dressed in his work uniform and holding a receipt, visibly upset. A small crowd had gathered, murmuring uneasily as they watched the scene escalate. Darnell, his voice trembling, tried to explain that he had just purchased a drink after completing his deliveries. He showed the officers his receipt and the delivery app on his phone. But they seemed uninterested in his story. The officers accused him of theft, their dismissive attitude fueling the tension in the air. Shaq stopped in his tracks, observing intently. Something about the scene set off alarm bells. Without hesitation, he approached, his towering 7-foot frame commanding attention. Despite the growing tension, Shaq remained calm, his voice steady as he addressed the officers. "Excuse me, officers. What seems to be the problem here?" One officer, startled by Shaq's imposing presence, turned to him with a curt response. "This doesn't concern you, sir. Please step back." Shaq's gaze didn't waver. Turning to Darnell, he asked, "What's going on here?" Darnell explained his situation, showing Shaq the evidence that supported his innocence. Shaq then faced the officers, holding up the receipt and delivery app. "It looks like he's telling the truth," Shaq said firmly. Why don't we check this out before jumping to conclusions? The officers, visibly uncomfortable under Shaq's scrutiny and the growing crowd recording the interaction, reluctantly agreed to verify Darnell's story. As they examined the evidence, Shaq placed a reassuring hand on Darnell's shoulder. "You're doing great," he said softly. "Don't let this shake you." The crowd, growing larger by the minute, began voicing their frustrations. "He's innocent!" shouted one woman. "Let him go!" another man added. The anger in the air was palpable, but Shaq remained the steady force in the middle, acting as both a protector for Darnell and a mediator for the situation. After what felt like an eternity, the officers concluded there was no evidence linking Darnell to any theft. His receipt matched the items in question, and his delivery logs corroborated his story. The officers removed the handcuffs, offering a half-hearted apology. But Shaq wasn't done. He stepped forward, addressing the officers with a calm yet firm tone. "This man deserves a proper apology," he said. "You can't just accuse someone, humiliate them in front of a crowd, and walk away like it never happened." Turning to the crowd, Shaq raised his voice. "This kind of thing happens too often, and it's not okay. We have to stand up for each other when we see something wrong." The crowd erupted in cheers, their anger turning into solidarity. Darnell, still visibly shaken, looked at Shaq with gratitude in his eyes. Before the officers left, Shaq asked for their badge numbers, ensuring accountability for their actions. He then exchanged contact information with Darnell, promising to follow up and make sure he had the support he needed. In the days that followed, videos of the incident went viral, with millions praising Shaq for his courage and compassion. Shaq, however, downplayed his role. "I just did what anyone should do," he said in an interview. "It's not about me. It's about making sure people are treated with respect and fairness." For Darnell, the experience was life-changing. "It's not just about what he did that day," Darnell said. "It's about knowing someone cared enough to stand up for me. It gave me hope." The incident sparked widespread conversations about racial profiling and justice in the community. Shaq continued to advocate for change, working with local leaders to foster dialogue between law enforcement and the neighborhoods they serve. Shaquille O'Neal has always been larger than life, not just for his height or basketball skills, but for his heart. On that sunny afternoon in Atlanta, he reminded the world that true champions don't just fight for themselves, they fight for others.